The wind came down from the north that evening, dry and sharp, carrying with it the scent of mesquite smoke and old blood. Jedediah Cain stood on his porch, a brittle-shouldered figure, with gray stubble, catching the dying light, watching the horizon stretch out like a vast, empty promise. The land was always like this in autumn, brittle as old bone, with the red clay earth splitting underfoot, and the sky burning itself to a blood-orange shade before night swallowed it whole. He'd come west 30 years earlier with a pistol, a saddlebag, and nothing much worth remembering behind him. Folks in these parts whispered over cards and whiskey that Cain had ridden with notorious men, the kind whose names made lawmen glance at the door and mothers clutch their young. He never confirmed it, nor denied it. He was just an old cowboy now, working a poor stretch of land too worn to sell and too stubborn to leave. The desert had been restless of late. Outlaws, renegades, and desperate men moved like wolves in the shadows, carving trails of ruin from one settlement to the next. The Apache, too, had been on the warpath, old treaties discarded like brittle paper, retaliation stacking upon retaliation. The air tasted of storm and gunpowder, and everyone knew something worse was coming. Cain had just finished checking the last of his water troughs when he saw the shape by the creek. At first, he thought it a coyote, half buried in dust and scrub. Then it moved, a frail, human sort of movement, and he cursed under his breath. He grabbed the Henry rifle from its place on the porch, more out of habit than intent, and made his way down the slope. It was a girl, Apache, young, no more than 12 or 13, though the filth and blood on her face made it hard to tell. Her hair was a tangled mess of raven-black strands, matted with dust and clotted blood. The shaft of an arrow protruded from her back, snapped near the fletching, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate pulls, each one a dry rattle. Cain knelt beside her. The blood in the dirt had turned to rust-colored mud. He looked up, scanning the horizon. Nothing but emptiness and dusk. Bringing her back to the homestead would be signing his own death warrant. Harboring an Apache was asking for a bullet in the head or a noose before dawn. More than that, if her kin found him with her, they'd gut him like a hog, without waiting for explanations. He looked down at her again. The girl's lips moved, murmuring something in a language Cain hadn't heard in years, but one he still half understood. It was a prayer, a small, broken thing meant for a mother long buried and a God that didn't answer these days. "You ain't dying out here," Cain muttered, not sure who he was talking to, her or himself. He slung his rifle across his back and lifted the girl in his arms. She weighed less than a sack of grain. The wound in her back seeped warmth against his shirt, and he could feel the tremor of her breath, like a moth's flutter against his throat. The journey back to the cabin was a long one, though it wasn't but a quarter-mile. The night air thickened as the sun vanished behind the jagged teeth of the canyons. Coyotes yipped somewhere to the west, answering one another in an eerie chorus. Inside, Cain laid the girl on his old oak table. The house smelled of wood smoke, dust, and loneliness. The hearth flickered low, a single lantern casting pale halos against the walls. Cain fetched the old tin basin from the shelf, filled it with water from the barrel, and went to work. He cut away the buckskin tunic, with the care of a man gutting a deer, muttering apologies she couldn't hear. The arrow had gone deep, and though the shaft was broken, the head was still lodged beneath her shoulder blade. He knew better than to leave it in. He'd seen too many men rot from wounds less severe. His fingers shook as he sterilized the knife in the fire. The girl's skin was hot to the touch, fever already setting in. Cain thought of his wife, of the way Martha's hands used to cool his brow when sickness took him after a winter ride. Thought of the boy, too, Jesse, no older than this one when a bullet took him in the back outside Tucson. That was a lifetime ago, or maybe only yesterday. The girl moaned when the blade bit flesh, but she didn't wake. Cain worked fast, clean, and sure, the old skills coming back like a familiar tune. When it was done, he packed a wound with boiled moss and old cloth strips. Blood soaked through them, but it would hold till morning. He found the wool blanket Martha's, folded in the trunk at the foot of the bed. It smelled of cedar and thyme. He draped it over the girl's slight frame, tucking it around her shoulders as the fire crackled and the wind rattled the shutters. The night deepened. Cain sat in the lone chair by the hearth, pouring himself a measure of whiskey from a bottle gone dusty with neglect. He watched the girl's chest rise and fall in uneven rhythm, and with every breath she took, he felt something old and rusted shift inside him. A man could look away from a lot of things out here: pain, death, the hollow eyes of widows, and the scorched remains of homesteads, but this was different. There was an innocence about her, one unbroken by the ruin of the world. If it died here, so would what was left of Cain. Outside, coyotes howled. The wind carried more than dust now. On the distant ridges, shapes moved, indistinct, shadowed against the thin, silver glow of the rising moon. Horsemen, too many to count at a glance, torches flickering like dying stars. Cain didn't see them, not yet. He poured another drink and stared into the fire, listening to the girl's faint breathing, unaware that in the darkness beyond his door, 800 Apache riders were closing the circle around his home. The night settled over the desert like a dark, smothering hand. The wind that had carried the day's heat was gone, leaving the land cold and brittle, the brittle chill creeping through every crack and splinter of Jedediah Cain's weathered cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a sluggish glow, the single lantern on the table throwing a weak, yellow light across the wooden floor. Shadows huddled in the corners, deep and thick, moving just enough to keep a man uneasy. Cain had drifted into a shallow sleep in the old rocking chair by the fire, his rifle within easy reach, one booted foot resting against the table leg. He didn't remember closing his eyes, nor could he say what had pulled him back from that thin, restless doze, only that something had. Some prickle at the base of his neck, some ancient instinct in his bones. He opened his eyes to the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the wrong kind. The kind of silence where even the coyotes had gone to ground, where the insects held their breath. The kind of silence that meant death was nearby, watching. His eyes moved first, flicking to the girl on the bed. She still breathed, barely, the wool blanket rising and falling against the flickering light. Her face glistened with sweat, strands of dark hair plastered to her temples. A low, feverish murmur escaped her lips, soft, desperate words in a language Cain hadn't heard spoken in years, but still remembered. Sheeta, Shuri Azdure Nadlihi. Blood riders, 800 strong, 800. Cain stiffened. Blood riders. The words cut through him like a knife of cold iron. He pushed himself upright and crossed to the window. The night outside was thick as ink, but his eyes had learned the ways of the desert long ago. There, a flicker, the brief flare of a torch being lowered, a dark shape moving against the sand-colored ridge. Another lower down. He strained his ears and caught it. The near-silent squeal of a dying horse, the wet, gurgling snap of a throat being cut. They were here, and they were closing the circle. Cain felt his gut tighten, a slow coil of dread he hadn't known in years. He went to the old armoire against the wall, pulled aside the worn sheepskin coat that hung there, and reached behind it. His fingers found the cold, familiar grip of his Winchester. The weapon was older than most of the men who would be coming for him, but she was clean and deadly. He slung it over his shoulder. From beneath the floorboards, he retrieved the 2 Colt Navy revolvers, their ivory grips dulled with use, and the Bowie knife he hadn't carried since the day he buried his boy. The cold steel felt heavier now, or maybe his hands had grown weaker. Either way, it would have to do. Outside, another flicker. More movement. Cain stepped out onto the porch, the cold air tightening his skin. He moved like a ghost, his boots soundless on the dry wood. The desert was alive with motion now, shapes sliding through the sage and scrub, figures flitting from shadow to shadow. Cain crouched by the post that held the rain barrel and felt along its surface. A fresh mark had been carved there. He ran his fingers over it. An old Apache war sign, 3 vertical lines crossed by a single slash. A death mark. It meant blood was owed here, and it would be taken before the night was done. His jaw clenched. The girl. It wasn't just about her. They'd come for her, but it wouldn't stop there. Someone out there knew him, or thought they did. Thought he still owed for some long-dead feud or old blood crime, and now they meant to collect. He stared out into the black, and for a long moment, the desert seemed to stare back. A memory came, unbidden. The dry crack of gunfire echoing between canyon walls, the thick copper stink of blood in the heat. A young man's face, barely more than a boy, wide-eyed and ragged, pulling a trigger too slow. Cain had killed him, back in '63. Killed too many like him. They called him the Gray Jackal then, a name spoken low in saloons and lawmen's offices, a hunter who stalked men by moonlight and settled debts no one else dared touch. He'd thought that man buried, but ghosts had a way of finding you. The steady, ominous pulse of a war drum began to thrum in the distance, slow, deliberate, as steady as a heartbeat. The sound rolled across the land like a promise. It would rise. It would build. It would not stop until dawn or until the earth drank its fill. Cain's mind snapped back into the present. He moved quick now, crossing the yard to the corral. The horses were already down, throats opened, their bodies left in silence. No chance of escape, no chance of calling for help. He returned to the house and barred the door, bolting it with the iron bar he hadn't touched in years. Inside he set to work, barricading the windows with whatever furniture he could move. He overturned the heavy table, pushed the cupboard against the east-facing wall, and tipped the water barrel inside to fill the hearth's old copper kettle. He scattered broken glass before the door, left powder kegs half-buried near the fence line with lantern wicks ready to be lit. He wouldn't win this fight, but by God, he'd make them bleed to take it. The girl stirred again. Cain knelt beside her. Her face was pale in the flickering light, the fever pulling her into some faraway place. He took a cloth, dampened it, and wiped the sweat from her brow. "You hang on, little dove," he muttered. "You hang on till dawn." He had no idea if she understood, but he said it anyway. Another drumbeat. Closer now. Cain crossed to the wall, loaded the Winchester with practiced hands, set the Colts on the table beside a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and drew a long, steady breath. This wasn't the way he'd pictured his end. Alone in a cabin, an injured girl in his bed, 800 riders closing in. Then again, he'd never imagined living this long at all. The fire cracked. Outside, torches bobbed along the ridge like tiny, hungry stars. Cain took his position by the window, rifle in hand, and waited for the dark to speak. The storm broke after midnight. A thin, needling rain swept across the desert, softening the dust and turning the hard-packed earth to sludge. Lightning tore ragged veins through the sky, each flash carving the blackness into stark white relief. In those sudden bursts of light, the mounted figures appeared like ghostly shapes along the ridges. Hundreds of them, their horses restless, their faces hidden behind war paint and shadow. The blood riders. Jedediah Cain watched them from the narrow slit of his window, the Winchester balanced steady in his weathered hands. His cabin, sturdy as it was, felt suddenly like a coffin, the walls too thin, the roof too low. Every instinct in his bones screamed that the noose was tightening, that by dawn either this place would be a charred husk, or it would stand on a mound of bodies. The war drums had slowed but never ceased, their cadence steady as a heartbeat. They weren't meant to frighten anymore. They were a promise. A soft sound behind him made Cain turn. Naiva stirred in the bed, her face slick with sweat, the fever still burning through her. But her eyes opened, dark and glassy, fixed on the low glow of the hearth. Her lips moved in a whisper, and Cain crossed quickly, leaning in to catch the words. "Blood riders," she breathed, her voice a cracked reed. 800 for my father, for Running Wolf." Cain stiffened. Running Wolf. His voice was little more than a scrape of gravel. She nodded weakly. "I am Naiva, his daughter." A sob caught in her throat. "They killed him settlers, but not settlers. White marauders wore good men's coats, burned our winter camp, took scalps like trophies. My brothers, my mothers." Her voice trailed off into a shuddered cough. Cain felt the old weight settle on his chest. Running Wolf. He remembered that name. Remembered the man, a proud, fierce warrior, years ago when Cain himself was a younger, faster man known as the Gray Jackal. There was a day in the dry hills north of Tucson when Cain and a posse cornered a small Apache hunting party. Men eager for blood had opened fire, cutting them down like cattle. But one of them had survived, crawling, broken-legged, into the shade of a dry arroyo. The posse had left him for the vultures. But Cain hadn't. He'd pulled the man from the sand, given him water, bound his leg, and told him to run. That man's name had been Running Wolf. And now, his daughter lay dying in Cain's bed, while 800 sworn avengers circled his land, unaware of the dead ode. Cain rose slowly, heart hammering. There was a chance, slim as it was. Not all Apache would remember a face, but among them was a man called White Owl, an elder even in Cain's youth. If he still breathed, he might remember the day Cain spared Running Wolf's life. Might. But first, Cain had to survive long enough to be seen. He moved through the cabin with grim efficiency, setting the last of his traps. He poured broken glass across the floor beneath each window, scattered what powder he had into narrow trenches leading from the fence line to the sheds, with oil-soaked rags bunched beside them. He tied the few remaining sticks of dynamite to a bundle of firewood near the doorway, rigging it so a pulled cord would tip the lot into the hearth flames. It wasn't much, but it was all a man alone could do. In the attic, buried beneath old hides and rusted tools, Cain retrieved the war shield. He hadn't touched it in years. The leather was cracked, the painted symbols faded but still visible, the crest of Running Wolf's clan, and the twin marks of peace. A relic from another time, when men had tried to end the killing. Cain wiped the dust from it and set it by the door. There was one last task. He crossed to the mantel, the light from the fire catching the edge of a small, weathered picture frame. It held the only image he had left of Martha, her face forever young, eyes bright, holding Jessie in her arms. Cain's throat tightened. He took a sheet of paper, yellowed and stiff, and wrote by the flicker of the flame. A letter, short and plain. If they find me, and the land is charred, know I faced it as a man ought to. Tell no lies of me. Bury me by Jessie. J.K. He placed it beneath the picture frame. Another lightning flash split the sky. This time, Cain saw the riders moving, a ripple in the darkness. The war drum slowed, then stopped. That was the signal. It had begun. Cain went to Nahava's side one last time. She lay motionless, her face drawn and pale, but the rise and fall of her chest told him she still fought. He brushed a damp lock of hair from her brow. "You rest now, little dove," he murmured, voice low and steady, though his hands were trembling. "I'll buy you the dawn." He slung the Winchester over his shoulder, checked the Colts, and stepped into the storm. The darkness before dawn was the blackest kind, a heavy, suffocating curtain that swallowed sound and blurred the line between earth and sky. The rain had turned the dust to mud, pooling in low hollows and carving slow rivulets through the dry creek beds. Above it all, the war drums throbbed, a steady, unbroken cadence that settled into the marrow of a man's bones and reminded him, with every beat, that his time was near. Jedediah Cain crouched in the shadow of his porch, the Winchester pressed tight to his shoulder. The torch lines in the hills drew closer, moving like a great serpent of fire and fury. The blood riders had waited long enough. Now they were coming. A sharp whistle cut through the rain-soaked dark, a command in the Apache tongue, and then the first wave broke from the shadows. They came fast and silent, a dozen at a time, riding low and hard, war paint streaked in crimson and soot. Cain didn't waste a shot. He fired once. The rifles cracked sharp as a whip crack in the night, and one of the lead riders pitched sideways, his torch tumbling to the mud. Another shot sent a second man reeling. The others scattered, startled by the precision. Cain used a moment, dragging the tripline tight and setting the first powder charge aflame. A deafening boom split the darkness as the keg near the corral went up, a wall of fire and shattered timber driving men and horses to the ground. He moved like a shadow through the cabin's defenses, from window to door to the edge of the yard, firing, vanishing, setting traps. Broken glass shredded the feet of those who pressed too close. Kerosene-soaked rags caught fire in the mud, turning the approach into a ring of flickering, uncertain light. The Apache warriors soon realized they faced no common settler. They spoke the name in hushed tones between assaults. Gazuliz, the gray jackal, the ghost who hunted men in the canyons decades past, a pale killer who vanished into legend. And now, it seemed, he'd risen from the dust of old age and grief. The second wave came harder. Arrows thudded into the walls, and one torch sailed through a window, igniting a bundle of dry kindling near the hearth. Cain stamped it out with a curse, his heart pounding. His ammunition dwindled. He retrieved a Colt and waited, the hammer cocked. In the bed, Naiva stirred, her eyes open to the storm-lit room, the reek of smoke and blood thick in the air. She saw the carnage outside, the shadowy figures circling. Her fevered mind cleared just enough to recognize what was happening. Painfully, she dragged herself from the bed, clutching at the walls for balance. Every breath was a battle, but she forced her limbs to move. The old signal drum rested against the far wall, forgotten in the chaos, a crude, worn thing, but its voice still carried weight among her people. Outside, Cain fired again. Another rider fell, another torch extinguished in the mud. But there were too many. Even a legend bled when outnumbered. Then a sharp, clear voice broke the steady drumbeat. Hazo-o. It was Old Apache, a word that meant peace. The voice came from the ridge. The blood riders halted as one, the storm hissing around them. Torches wavered. Men peered toward the voice's source. An elder rode slowly forward, a thin, weathered man draped in faded hides, his face marked by deep lines and old scars. His name was White Owl, and even the boldest warriors lowered their eyes at his approach. Cain saw him and knew him. The old man spoke again, this time in the white man's tongue. The jackal. I know you. Cain straightened slowly, lowering the rifle, though his heart pounded like a war drum in his chest. He stepped out into the open, rain streaking his face, mud sucking at his boots. The torches painted him in flickering amber, his long gray hair plastered to his skin, his coat torn and blackened with soot. Neither man spoke for a long moment. The rain pattered, the horses shifted restlessly, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the cabin doorway, a small, broken voice called out, "Sheeta." It was Naiva. She leaned against the threshold, her face pale, streaked with blood and rain. Her voice quivered but carried. "He saved me, daughter of Running Wolf, blood debt owed." Gasps rippled through the gathered warriors. Men glanced to White Owl, whose eyes narrowed, ancient memory flickering in their depths. Cain stood motionless, his hands empty, water trickling from his hat brim. He spoke softly. "I spared your chief once. His daughter found my doorstep. I gave her shelter. No quarrel here." White Owl raised a hand. "Stand down," he commanded in Apache. The war drum ceased. The rain fell harder, washing blood from the earth. In the torchlight, Cain saw shoulders slump, weapons lower. Men looked to one another, uncertain now, the rage of the night dissipating like smoke on the wind. For the first time in hours, the land fell silent. Cain's knees felt weak, but he held his ground. White Owl spoke once more, his voice grave. "The dead is remembered. This night is done." And the siege broke. Dawn broke slow and colorless over Broken Mesa. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a landscape of charred earth and scattered bodies. Wisps of smoke curled from smoldering timbers, and the acrid scent of gunpowder lingered in the air. The once dry ground had turned to a thick, muddy paste where blood and rain had mixed. A pale, indifferent sun pushed through the low clouds, painting everything in shades of cold gray. Jedediah Cain stood at the center of it all, his body aching, his coat heavy with rain and blood. His arms hung loose at his sides, the rifle long since empty, his Colts discarded near the steps of his battered porch. The once proud cabin was pocked with arrows, its walls scorched by torch fire, but it still stood, and so did Cain. The blood riders gathered at the edge of the clearing, their numbers thinned but still formidable, horses restless beneath them. Their faces were unreadable now, the fever of the night's violence, cooled by the dawn. They had seen something in the darkness, something that did not fit with the stories they'd been told of broken settlers and easy slaughter. White Owl rode to the fore, his thin frame hunched beneath a faded wolfskin cloak. His face was lined with time and war, but his eyes remained sharp as river stones. In the rising light, Cain saw the recognition there, and something else too, a reluctant respect. Naiva stood beside the old man, her frame frail beneath a wool blanket, blood staining the edges where her wound had reopened. But she stood tall, her face defiant, her voice steady as she spoke. "In my father's name," she said, "this man is owed a blood debt, running Wolf's life for mine. The word of Naiva, daughter of the wolf." Her words carried over the clearing, reaching every ear. Even the horses seemed to still, as though the land itself listened. White Owl gave no immediate reply. The war drums were silent now, but the tension hung thick in the wet morning air. Cain stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud. "I ask no mercy," he said, voice low but clear. "Only safe passage for the girl. My land, my life, they're yours, if it buys her way back to her people." A ripple moved through the blood riders, some exchanging uneasy glances. They had not come to trade or bargain. They had come to burn, to avenge. But something unspoken held them now. White Owl raised his hand, palm outward, commanding silence. "This man," he said, voice carrying like a sermon, "is not as others. Long ago, he spared the life of a warrior. That debt was forgotten by many, but not by the earth, nor by the spirits of the slain. Naiva speaks true. Her blood carries the right to call it due." A long, charged pause followed. Then, with a motion of his hand, White Owl signaled for the war drums to be struck. Once, a single, resonant beat, not for battle but for peace. The warriors sheathed their blades. Torches were doused. The dead were gathered in silence, their bodies wrapped in hides and lifted onto saddles. None approached Cain, nor spoke to him. Yet none raised a hand against him either. Naiva limped toward the elder, supported by two younger women who had dismounted. Before she left, she turned to Cain, her gaze meeting his. "I will remember," she said softly. Cain gave a single nod, words thick in his throat. There was nothing else to say. And then they were gone. The blood riders rode out with the dead in tow, their numbers melting into the gray morning mist, the hoofbeats fading across the empty plain. The land grew still again, the only sound the faint trickle of rain from the cabin's broken eaves. Cain stood alone. He gathered his weapons and placed them on the porch, leaving them there. Inside, he set the photograph of Martha and Jessie back on the mantel, the edges charred but the faces untouched. He poured the last of the whiskey into a tin cup, downed it in a single pull, and watched the pale dawn creep through the battered window. He felt no triumph, no pride, only the familiar ache of things lost long ago. Weeks later, travelers passing through Broken Mesa found the homestead empty. The cabin door hung open, swaying in the wind. Inside, no sign remained of the battle, save the scorch marks and arrow holes. And a grave. A lone marker stood beneath the old mesquite tree at the edge of the clearing, a simple stone with words carved by a steady, calloused hand. "For those I could not save." Word spread in the saloons and way stations. Riders spoke of the night 800 warriors surrounded an old man's home, and of how he held them off until dawn. Some claimed it was Cain. Others swore it was the gray jackal returned from the dead. The facts blurred, as they always did, but the legend settled into the dust and timber of the frontier. And in the long, restless dark between campfires, men still told the story of the night the blood riders came and rode away.